Can you imagine having a day off and then being able to take that day off and walk and talk with Jesus? Like, can you imagine that? How nice that would be? Well, that's what's happening in the story we're going to jump into today. Jesus and his disciples are going for a walk one day, and that day happens to be a Sabbath day, which will play into the story, so make sure we all pay attention to that. So they're going on a walk on this Sabbath day, and we're going to need to move that. I need to be able to see their faces over here. But as they meander, they're probably having some lighthearted conversations, as friends are known to do when they are walking and talking leisurely. Especially this weather right now. It's just nice. It's nice walking weather and all that. And so they're just walking and talking. And as you leisurely walk and talk, eventually you get hungry. At least I do. Yeah. And so eventually they're going through this field, and the field ripe with grain, and they go for a little granola. They go ahead and grab a little grain, and they go ahead and snack on that. And now here's the thing: the Pharisees see. The Pharisees see this happening, and the Pharisees who had accumulated over the years, by the way, I'm sitting because it's going to be a little more teachy today. I'll let you know, I'll warn you when to get the notes out, but it's going to be more teachy today. But the Pharisees, this is just fun information I found at my study, have accumulated at this point in their history over 39 sections of Sabbath prohibitions, neatly organized those 39 sections into simply 24 chapters of a book that in some manuscripts is 156 pages double-sided on just the Sabbath. Those are rules on just the Sabbath. That's like a level of intensity and detail of a user manual that is something insanely important, right? 156 pages double-sided on, all the rules of using Sabbath, or really not using Sabbath, right? Like not doing things on Sabbath and all that. And we're about to see, even with all of those 156 pages, that they didn't get it at all. And so they see Jesus and his disciples picking grain and eating it, which was strictly forbidden in their law. Their law, mind you, not God's law, but their law. And their law was actually above and beyond to protect people from breaking God's law. But either way, the condemnation came the same. So here's the thing. God has his law. Pharisees are like, well, let's create more laws to keep us from getting even close to breaking God's law, which sounds good, doesn't it? But then the condemnation that they dole out, either way, whether you're breaking their laws or God's law, is the same. You're still an evil person and you're still a terrible person. How dare Jesus and his disciples do that day? Now, Jesus is going to go in this story, in just a second we get into it. He's going to hearken back to commands and principles in the Old Testament. And whenever he does that, whenever Jesus hearkens back to the Old Testament, he's always going to bring his listeners to a deeper understanding of it. Whenever he goes back, he's going to go, this is Jesus, the one who came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So he's going to always go and go, let's understand this a little deeper. For instance, let's think about it. When Jesus goes ahead and is like, okay, you've heard it said, thou shalt not murder. But I tell you, if you wish they were dead, that's just as bad. So when Jesus does that, he's going deeper, yes? And the same as when Jesus is teaching, he goes, okay, you've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery. Don't do that. But also, if you're thinking and fantasizing it, you're doing the same thing. It's the same problem. God's issue is the heart behind it. So he's always kind of bringing us to a deeper level of understanding of this. Yes?
Yeah.
So the Pharisees say, Sabbath breaker, you're breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus is like, okay, let's talk about the Sabbath. Let's do that. Let's go back and let's talk about the Sabbath. And just like at other times when we see in the New Testament where the new covenant is being established, it doesn't give us less that's asked of us. Now, we're not actually having less asked of us. It's usually more, but it's a different kind of more here with the Sabbath. So it's not a matter of, okay, well, we're off the hook with this whole Sabbath thing. He's going to give us a deeper understanding and a deeper appreciation, calls to a deeper obedience. And in this short teaching from Jesus, I want us to look at these powerful words he says in Mark 2, 27 and 28. And he said to them, and actually, we're going to do something we don't normally do it live, because this is going to be a little bit more me teaching today. Is it up there? Are you capable of reading? I know you are. I just wanted to go ahead and get you to be like, I am capable. Okay, so here's what's going on. We're going to say the words of Jesus here together. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Son of Man is Jesus talking about himself in third person. It's okay if he does it, by the way. But he's saying, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. Now, ironically, this is Mark's gospel here. In Matthew's gospel, I know some of you are maybe new to Alive, or maybe you just missed last week, the first of the series, and that's fine. But here's the thing. Last week, we started the series in Matthew 10. Jesus says this famous thing, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Yeah. In Matthew's gospel, this is the next story. I kind of wanted to pick in Mark's because I kind of like some of the things that are said here, but like in Matthew's story, in his rendition of the story, he's going, by the way, this happens right after Jesus going, I want to give you a yoke, a way of living that's different than the Pharisees. And I'm going to give you rest. So isn't it funny when you think about it? Like that story then, the next story Matthew goes into is like, and then Jesus got to illustrate this in this moment by having his disciples and him going to pick some grain, and he's going to go have to show how his teaching now is different from the Pharisees, and he's going to tell us what the Sabbath is all about. Now it's interesting to me how we probably need to hear the opposite part of the sentence that the Pharisees need to hear. And this is what we need to hear. Let's go right into the first point here. If you're a note taker, here we go. Get ready. We've got a lot of notes to cover today. But the first thing is that Sabbath was made for man. So he starts this sentence by saying the Sabbath was made for man, right? Mm-hmm. Not man made for the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. Jesus' original audience, in case you don't know, are Jewish people. They're Jewish people, first century, who had an unbelievably, as we already talked about, long list of rules that they had to abide by in order to keep the Sabbath. And how many do we have in American culture now? Anybody? How many rules do we have about Sabbath in American culture? How many rules? Yeah, Sabbath laws and rules. How many are you afraid of breaking today, if today is the Sabbath, in fact? If you're afraid the cops are going to, some of you all, you know what it is, to be driving, and all of a sudden you have that like, oh no, I didn't realize there's a cop behind me, right? Come on, you know you've been there, right? You didn't know there was a cop behind you. You're all of a sudden kind of like, please don't let them be pulling me over. Please don't let them be pulling me over. Here's the thing. There are not really any laws. Now, back in my glory days, not our glory days, but back in my glory days, I remember places being closed on Sundays, and not just Chick-fil-A. Like things were closed on Sundays. It was like a thing. They were not open on Sundays, and like it was a thing because they were like, we just want a day off and all kind of stuff. And it was the last wisps of fog of Sabbath as a cultural value in America. You know, now it's long gone. And I'm not trying to get a knock, you know, that kind of thing. I'm just saying, like in Jesus' day, whew, it was a big deal. So much so that they had specific regulations, just so you know, on household chores. That like 156-page book, it got into chores and what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. And some of us are like, oh, no problem. I'm not going to break any of those. Give me any day and I won't break those if you just tell me, you know. But like they had household chores. They had rules about the distances that you could walk on that day. They had rules. This is fun. I'm not even making this up. On how many letters you could write on the Sabbath. So if you're like, really? Like, yes, they had rules about all those kinds of things. So Jesus' original audience of first century Jews, it was critical that they hear both the first, but really the second half of what Jesus said. The Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. They needed to get, like, Josh, you are not created by God just to serve this Sabbath concept, this Sabbath principle, this Sabbath idea. Okay, you're more than that. You weren't made to just simply obey these rules and regulations. Because they were so consumed by legalism that they had missed the whole heart of Sabbath. Because that's what legalism does. It's just real quick. Legalism, whether it's religious legalism or secular legalism, which there are both, by the way. Yeah, exactly. I'm going to... Because legalism is simply this. When you take a good principle, a good idea, and you create so much rules and regulations that it eventually starves out the heart of that goodness of that first idea. And again, it can happen in religious circles, and it can happen in secular circles too. There can be some good values that get so regimented, so legalistic, and all of a sudden it's like, man, they take the intent that could have been good and just rob it of anything. But you know what? Isn't it neat and tidy to be legalistic? Because you do good and you feel good about the good that you're doing, and that self-righteousness feels so good. That's why the Pharisees don't walk around kind of like heads hanging low. They're like, no. Look at me. Look at all I'm doing. I am such a good person. I will even tell you how to be good. And I'll ask you to do more than I'm even willing to do. Jesus tells them that they're willing to do. So anyway, legalism always gets to a point, because of this, where it gets to be nonsensical. And again, I'm not going to pick on secular legalism because that's not my point today, but it gets nonsensical to a point in our world where you're like, well, that doesn't even make sense with what I thought we're arguing for. Same thing with Pharisees, okay? Pharisees would allow themselves in that day to go walk into the kitchen on a Sabbath day, grab some, pita and hummus, and go ahead and have a little lunch on that day. If it was already made, just go ahead and enjoy it. They would be allowed to do that. But when Jesus walks with his disciples through a field, grabbing some grain that God allowed to grow right there, and they just chomp on it, well, then they're breaking the law. But the work level is not really different, is it? It's just kind of nonsensical. It just doesn't make sense. But for their laws, it makes sense because you're not allowed to go through a grain field and collect grain on that and eat it and all kind of stuff. So it doesn't make sense. They're kind of going ahead and calling him out for doing this. And this is what gets funny about it, okay? This is why legalism is so dangerous for any of us. Because they go ahead and in their minds get to a point where Jesus is healing on the Sabbath. I mean, we're going to get into some of that. Can you imagine? How dare? He's healing on the Sabbath. He is obviously eating grains that he picked in a field on the Sabbath and all that kind of stuff. And so there's the Pharisees, and this is the irony. Are you guys with me this morning?
Yeah.
The Pharisees get so ticked, and I'll use that word because my nieces are in the room, so ticked at Jesus, so livid at Jesus, that he dare break the Sabbath by eating and by healing, that they plot to murder him on the Sabbath. So apparently it's okay to plot murder on a Sabbath, but not to heal on a Sabbath, according to the Pharisees. That's what legalism does to us. It gets us to a point where we're like, well, this just makes sense because I'm so outraged by what I believe is true. But anyway, we're not like first century Jews with way too many rules and loops to navigate when it comes to keeping the Sabbath socially, right? Let's be honest, we have no rules. No fines to pay, no life to lose. We're not afraid of getting stoned or anything like that because we didn't rest tonight. In ancient times, you would probably look at somebody and you'd not want to tell Philip that I worked all 7 days this past week. I didn't, by the way. I'm in a Sabbath series. I have to be doing it right now. I have to be Sabbathing. But in ancient times, you would be hesitant to tell somebody that you'd worked all 7 days because you'd be afraid of the ramifications, right? And nowadays, we're like waiting to go ahead and tell somebody. We can't wait to tell, oh yeah, it's been a rough week. I didn't take a day off. It's been nonstop. New school semester. I'm telling you, it's just like no rest for me. I got bills to pay. I've got all these things going on. I can't remember the last time I had a day off. And we're humble bragging. We're like, oh, look at me. Aren't I so important? Aren't I so special? And so we're quite different from them. So thank the Lord that the Lord of the Sabbath went ahead and spoke when he did, both to first century Christians and to 21st century Christians. Because here's the thing. We don't need so much the second half of it. We really, really, really need the first half of it. And here it is. Let's look at it again. He said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, right? Not man for the Sabbath. So the Sabbath was made for you. God, do you get what I'm saying here? This is like mind-blowing in a sense. God made Sabbath for you. I made this for you. That's what I think we called this message today. I made this for you. God's going, I made this Sabbath for you. That's how the story starts, In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And over the course of the next 6 days, he creates all the elements that would inhabit this earth and would make it inhabitable for us. So God goes about creating over 6 days all these things. And he says, and it was pretty good. I mean, he said so himself. Like, this is a pretty good creation he did. And on the 6th day, God would make his crowning achievement, honestly, and he'd say, this isn't just good, this is very good. It was mankind. He made Adam and Eve, and he had men and women, and his image and all that kind of stuff. And then the new chapter begins. It literally, in your Bible, if you have it, you can look at it. Genesis 2, a new chapter. So we got creation. Genesis 2 begins with this. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the which day? On the seventh day. So on that seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day. What did he do? He blessed the seventh day, and then he also made it holy. Okay, this is going to factor in later on. Because on it, God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So up to this point, God had been continually making something out of nothing. And on the seventh day, God then suddenly decides to go ahead and out of all that something now, make nothing. A day for just rest. Isn't that kind of fascinating? Like, he's going to go, okay, let's just, a day of rest, a full day, by the way, if we're trying to learn what Sabbath is in this series, it was a full 24 hours. Like, it was a full day. So if you're like trying to piecemeal it, like by chunking it up in the week, God took a day, 24 hours of rest and stopped working. And what's fascinating is that he didn't just make this for himself. In fact, God didn't really need to rest. Like, it wasn't like God was tired out from this, but he made it for us because he knew we would need it. God creates the seventh day rest, and then he steps into it, and then he looks to us on the other side and says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Meet me in this day. It's a blessed day. It's a holy day. So God doesn't need it, but God comes into it and steps into it and practices it himself, that first ever Sabbath day ever in history, and says, come on, come in here. Come in. The water's nice. It's really nice. And here's what's fascinating for me. Okay, and there's so many things today that are fascinating to me. Hopefully some of this stuff actually matters to you. But you know what's interesting when you think about it? If God created man, and again, those of you who went to like Sunday school or something like that, on which day did God create Adam and Eve? Sixth day, yes, on the sixth day. And then God says, okay, we're going to have a Sabbath day on the seventh day. So the first full day of mankind being on earth is a rest day. I know. God gives them work, and this is before the fall. Work is not bad, and he's going to call them to it. But God goes, you're going to work from a place of rest, not for it. You're going to go ahead, and on your first day, full day here, let's go ahead and let's take a leisurely walk. Maybe eat some grains out of the field, something like that, before those Pharisees come along thousands of years later and yell at me. Let's just enjoy this rest. And it's cool, because God didn't need to do it, but he's like, let me show you how this is done first. And so it was written into creation. So Sabbath isn't part of like the old covenant, the old law or something like that. It's part of the created order of the universe, which, by the way, means if we're going against Sabbath, if we're trying to fight it, you're going against the grain of the very universe and the way that God created it. And philosopher H.H. Farmer once said, if you go against the grain of the universe, you get splinters. Catch that? So I think for some of us we're fighting Sabbath and it's not working, just like you can fight gravity, but it doesn't work. Like, it's a principle, it's a reality, it is what is. And so it's really interesting how this 7-day rhythm came about. I mean, come on, a day is determined, those of you science nerds, by how long it takes the Earth to complete its rotation, right? That's how long a day is. A month is determined by the time it takes the moon to orbit the Earth. A year is determined by the time it takes Earth to orbit the sun. But a week is determined by the rhythm that God gave us in the creation story. There's no like sun, moon, stars, or any of that stuff. It's just God going, all right, 6 days I created and 7th day I rested. There we go, 7-day week. That's what we're going to do. And mankind's like, okay, and has been doing it since. It's like he worked 6 days and then rested on the 7th. And he said, okay, I want you to work 6 days and I want you to rest on the 7th. This was made for you. I made you a little something. It's called rest. And Sabbath was given to man to serve us then. Yes? Not for us to serve it. You're not created to serve Sabbath. Sabbath was made by God for us. Thank you very much, Pharisees. But it's a service. Can I just be honest with you alive this morning? This is why I'm really pumped about this series. This Sabbath service is one that some of us desperately need because we've dangerously neglected it. And so because we're made for that rest rhythm, our souls naturally, intrinsically just long for it. I mean, just look at the advertising around us and think about what often we're seeing when we look at advertising. Isn't it oftentimes that we see essentially a sort of Sabbath? Like there's a couple who are drinking coffee, reading newspapers in bed with no care in the world. They're just kind of like slow pace. There's a man, I can just picture it right now. I think it's for like Adobe or something like that. And he's just like laying on a couch with his guitar, just kind of playing his acoustic guitar without a care in the world. A group of friends on a beach having a picnic, just kind of hanging out and enjoying it. A mom calmly settling in her comfy couch while the world races around her, but she's blissfully unfazed by it. Can't you picture the advertising that we see that's this kind of stuff? Yes? Like, marketing agencies all over the world understand that you and I ache for this kind of life, but that you don't have it, but that you really, really want it. You really, really want a life that is like that is full of rest. Our hearts yearn for Sabbath, but that's just it though. New bed sheets aren't going to rightly replace real Sabbath. DoorDash can't deliver you the depths of Sabbath. And you can try asking Alexa all day long, but she'll never be able to give you Sabbath on your speaker or magically appearing at your doorstep. Like, it just doesn't work that way. And that's what we're constantly searching for is we try and buy. All the while our hearts and our souls are going, I just want to rest. I just want to Sabbath. I just want to calm down. They say sleeping like a baby, but babies don't sleep, honestly, too well until they get to that sweet spot. But I just think we all want that like hammock kind of slow-paced day, gentle breeze, your drink of choice in hand, kind of like that. Like, just a no-rush kind of thing. And so you know what? Y'all still with me?
Yeah.
Good, because we're really just getting started, I know. But so what ends up happening is, because your heart longs for this. And again, we're all on the same page right now, right? Like, you're not like, no, I actually hate rest. Some of us are workaholics, but even still, I think the workaholics are like, the sense of like, would be nice for 5 minutes. Anyway, so we have that. But the problem is we don't have that if we don't have it in Christ. If we're not following the Sabbath, we don't have it. So what we do is we go, I want this, but we haven't figured out Sabbath yet. So what we start doing is replacing it with things like entertainment or leisure or amusement, which are pretty kind of close to it. They're kind of like the cotton candy version of it. So it's a quick sugar high of watching a Netflix series, over the course of 2 days, or something like that. Or the sense of like going on a vacation, but then of course you want the vacation from the vacation. We've all said that too, yeah. And so we're kind of chasing it, and these cotton candy sugar highs are dropping us lower and lower, which is why our souls aren't any more energized and healthy than at the end of it, after binging Netflix, than they were before. So because Sabbath was made for man, a critical part of that creation of our livelihood, we can keep it and it'll help us. But it shouldn't be terribly surprising that when we break it, we get broken in the process too. And when we break the Sabbath idea, we have things like burnout, stress, literally like physical ailments because we're working too hard. We're not resting. So we physically get ill and sick, and our immune systems are trashed. Brain fog, frayed relationships with other people because we're stressed and burned out, yes? And I don't know about anybody, but maybe even distance from God. We're so busy, we kind of realize, I feel far away from God. Did you know that Seventh-day Adventists are pretty dogmatic about the Sabbath thing? Yes? Like it's literally in their name, Seventh-day Adventists. So they're pretty dogmatic about it. Okay, if you take the average person's lifespan and they were to take a day off every, let's say, 7 days, and they take a day off and they Sabbath every 7 days over the course of the average lifespan, it would add up to 10 to 11 years. I know. That's a lot of wasted time, isn't it? Just to give away to God like that. You could really redeem that. Okay, so back to Seventh-day Adventists. Did you know that they take, again, that whole seventh-day rest kind of thing pretty seriously and all that? And on average, their lifespan is 10 to 11 years longer than the average other person in society. Yeah. Yeah. Now, here's the deal. I'm not trying to convert us to Seventh-day Adventism, okay? Not to that theology and all that. But what I am saying is that, like, as followers of Jesus in this non-denominational church, people who follow, I forgot to bring my Bible. It's up here somewhere, though. Aha. People who simply follow God at his word, he tells us to take a day of rest every 7 days. He invites us into that 10 to 11 years extra. Like, he invites us to go, hey, you don't have to have that crazy pace and all that. That's literally God's design for us. And this is a crazy thing, okay? This Sabbath thing is actually God's view, and it's God's version of self-care, and it's way healthier than every other version out there. Like, I'm not anti-self-care. I just think most versions are just all about me. And God's going, I created one for you, and you hate it. Take the one I gave you, And so God creates the Sabbath day, and he calls it blessed, and he made it holy. Blessed means there's profound goodness that will be found in it, that we've begun to explore, okay? We've kind of looked at that a little bit. But now let's look at him making it holy and what that means. So here's the second idea. Sabbath was made to make us set apart. And it starts by the Sabbath day being set apart, which is what holy means, by the way. When it says that he made the day holy, it means set apart. So the seventh day was unlike the sixth day. And God establishes his people and says, you're going to be different than other people. Let's look at a little bit of a chunk of scripture in Exodus 31. The Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel, so he's given them the law, and say to them, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is going to be a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you, bless you, may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. And sanctify you is to make you holy. So God's saying, I want you to keep this day holy because I want you to know that I'm the God who makes you holy. All right. It's pretty simple, but he's kind of, okay. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. I am so glad, by the way, that we can see that God takes it seriously, but that God has given us more grace in this new covenant than we had in the old covenant. Different rules here. But he takes it seriously. Yeah. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done. Go ahead and do it. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It's a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So again, he's saying, I started off creation by making this day holy. Now I'm asking you to just keep it holy. I made it holy, now you keep it holy. It started off as a day dedicated to God and glorifying him, and it's like the fine china of days. It's the choice wine of days. You only bring it out on special occasions, you know? It's the date night of days, a special day. It's a really important special day, a day that God had set apart as special, a special chance for you and I to meet with him and just delight in him. And he tells his people that this is going to be of paramount importance for them being known as his people. This is going to be one of the big reasons, again, what Madeline shared with me a couple months ago, I was like, that's going to come into our series because it really is one of the ways God says, like, I want you to stand out and be different in this way. And I think it really is different when you think about it, to live this way, isn't it? In a world that demands that we produce and consume, a world that tells us that your worth and your value is determined by what you can do, right? Come on, I know I'm, right? Like, if you don't produce, if you can't do, we in our American culture are very utilitarian. Your value is determined by how much you can produce. Right? By and large. And so anyway, a world that no matter if you talk to a barista, a stay-at-home mom, a firefighter, a teacher, an analyst, an interior decorator, a plumber, a therapist, a CEO, or a person on unemployment, they'll almost always answer you when you ask them how they're doing with that magical word, busy. I'm good. I'm just really busy. Just really good. You don't have a job or, you know, whatever, poor or rich, black or white or Asian or Hispanic or whatever it might be, doesn't matter. If you ask them how they're doing, I'm busy. The way of the world, the communal identity of the world is busy. I quoted this book back in our, I think, Babylon series, Thriving in Babylon. Just such a good book. Faith for This Moment, Rick McKinley says, Sabbath is a radical practice of communal identity through which we prophetically announce that the people of God belong to God and have been rescued from the idols of wanting more and getting more. We confess that our God feeds us in the wilderness, and we will not live out of fear of scarcity. Sabbath is the physical demonstration of the spiritual reality that we are secure in the God who has saved us. It's a mark of who we are and who we trust. And it's not that much unlike tithing when you think about it. So let me just go ahead and, let's talk about tithing for a second. So tithing is this principle that biblically 10% of what I make is not mine, it's God's. I'm returning it to him. So again, we can get into it, but it's a biblical principle, and let's just believe it for now that it is, okay? The reason, though, it's so valuable is because God says he'll bless us then when we do that. He's like, test me in this and I'll bless you and all that stuff. So I can choose, and I do choose, just so you know, to take 90% and live with that blessed than 100% and not have it blessed. Because it's holy. And God takes seriously holy things. And he doesn't want to. So it's the same days. I'd rather 6 days that have God's blessing on them, 6 days of work that have God's blessing on them, than 7 days of work that maybe don't. Do you see what I'm saying here? The idea is going, God has said this is blessed, this is holy, we want to treat it that way. He takes holy things seriously, and we should, as his people who are separate too, should do that as well. So the interesting thing is we keep the Sabbath holy, and keeping the Sabbath holy kind of helps keep us holy and set apart. So it's kind of like you're feeding the thing that's feeding you. Like you're keeping it holy, you're going, I'm going to honor this, and then by doing that, God's going, all right, look, doesn't that make you different? Doesn't that make you unlike everyone else? Because we've found a way to break out of the way that the world has a plan for us and get into one that actually is different. Because, like, honestly, just the Sabbath, just honoring the Sabbath is a way that we can not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds so that we are different than our classmates, different than other moms, different than other retirees, different than our neighbors in the way that we view and do life. Because it's like, you know what? No, I do take a day. You don't do any work? Nah, the kids don't do any work. We don't do any work. Wouldn't it be nice? Oh, I know, it's not super easy or convenient, but it's super refreshing. I feel great. I'll tell you this, like, I love Sabbath. That's why I preach this, like, so passionately, because I'm just like, man, I know it's hard for you. And that's why we had to go last week where we did last week. But it's just that if you can live differently, you're likely going to feel differently. I'm convinced of it. You know, you just kind of live differently, and it's going to make the life feel differently. The social pressures that make life too difficult aren't going to weigh on you the same way they did before. We're going to be on a different rhythm, you know, so to speak. But this brings us to the point where we should look at the 2 times in the 10 Commandments that God mentioned Sabbath. Are you guys still with me? I knew as I was getting ready for this week, I had a lot of things. We have next steps starting today, by the way. I know a number of you are signed up. I think we're almost at capacity, but if you're interested, I'll tell you more about it. And there's still room. I think there's still food. You can eat my food. I don't need it. We want to pack it out. We're going to have a great time. But here's the thing. I really think that the Sabbath is so important that out of the 10 Commandments, if you were to make it a pie chart, 37% of the pie chart of the words of the 10 Commandments are the Sabbath commandment. 37%. And how many commandments are there?
10.
Yeah. So percentage-wise, it gets a lot. Like the don't murder people one, that's 1%. I did the math. 1%. By the way, still an important 1%. Okay? So it's not like, well, that one doesn't sound important then. Yeah, no, it's still important and we don't want to do that one. But 37%, God's like, let's talk about it. Here's the interesting thing. In Deuteronomy, when God goes ahead and gives it to him, he's going to go ahead and we're going to go back to Exodus. Exodus is first. 40 years later in Deuteronomy, he's talking to a people who are about to inhabit the promised land. And here's what we see as we look at this first command. It's that we're set apart as those who know they're no longer slaves. So note takers, that would be number 3. We're set apart as those who know they're no longer slaves. Now, hopefully if you've written it down, we can go to Deuteronomy 5, 12 to 15. Here's the 4th commandment in Deuteronomy. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Sounds repetitive, right? We're not reading the same scriptures, but it's mentioned a number of times. You catching that? Yeah? Well, anyway, it goes on and says, on it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember. Now, here's the reason he's going to give for why we do this. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So this is, note takers, the external battle of keeping the Sabbath and not keeping the Sabbath. This is the external one. The idea of the Egyptians had for 400 years kept the Israelites in slavery. That was an external battle of not resting because they maybe would have loved to have a rest day, but as slaves, you don't get one. And so for us, sometimes we feel that pressure. The reality is for many of us, we feel like, and we talk like we're in a sort of slavery. You know, we don't think a Sabbath is possible because of the pressures of our world. But here's my question. Are those pressures God's pressures? Are we living out a story that the world is telling us we need to live? Are we living really as God has designed us to? Because see, the Lord had to command Israel to observe the Sabbath and keep the Sabbath, but this is 40 years after they had even been slaves. So God has to remind them and say, hey, don't forget that there was a point in time where you had to do this work every day, all 7 days of the week, and you didn't have a choice. But now I've given you a choice. And you have a new way of doing things, a new story that you can write here. And instead, what the voices that they're hearing externally is you've got to have what everyone else has, right? You've got to do all the things that everyone else does. Your kids need to take advantage of every opportunity, every single possible sport or activity they need to do. You've got to put in a little bit more and get a little bit more and accomplish a little bit more. You can't just take a day to rest and rejoice and be glad and carefree. You can't afford that. You need to do more. So just do more and more and more. There's more work to be done, so just get to it. There's a restlessness in our world, isn't there? You're stressed out just hearing it?
Yeah.
It's not what I'm saying to you.
I know.
I'm just saying, it's the restlessness of our world. And it's not unlike the restlessness of Egyptian slavery, where the Egyptians, when we get into their story, by the way, the Egyptians are looking at the Israelites and are like, you guys think you have it so easy. That's why you want to go out there and worship your God in the wilderness. And in the story, when we get into the story of the Exodus happening, they just make life harder for them. They go ahead and say, you're going to produce the same amount of bricks, but you're going to go ahead and get the straw for it. They're just going to make it harder and harder for them. And it's because, at the end of the day, that's the way of slavery, is just do more, you accomplish more, maybe not having more resources, but you just need to make more happen. See, back in my day, again, I'm really aging myself today, but back in my day, anybody old enough to go ahead and remember when tool was an insult? Yeah. I don't know if kids these days do that anymore, but back in my day, if you looked at someone and it was like, you're a tool, it was not a compliment. I don't think it would be a compliment now, but I'm not sure it would be a good insult either. But that's what slavery does to you. Slavery makes you a tool. The slavery of the way of the world, the pattern of the world, simply says you are a tool that as you operate, you're just designed for production and accomplishment. And we've forgotten that we're actually human beings, not human doings. That we're invited in that 7th day, that first full day of creation, to just be. To just be with God and rest in that. That's why I think it's fascinating that in Deuteronomy, God changes the wording from the way he gave the same command in Exodus. Because in Exodus, it's honor, which we'll get to in just a second. In Deuteronomy, it's observe. Like, how do we observe Memorial Day, or observe Veterans Day, or observe Juneteenth? Well, we recall and reflect on Memorial Day the reality of those who gave their lives in protection of our country. And on Veterans Day, we recall and we reflect on those who are living among us who have served and sacrificed to serve our country. And on Juneteenth, we recall and reflect the sordid past of slavery in America and the goodness of a day when finally the good news of slavery's end met the ears and tired backs of those in Texas. Right? We recall and reflect. So when Jesus says, I want you to observe the Sabbath, it's a matter of, I want you to recall and reflect on the fact that you're not a slave anymore. That Jesus invites us to go, you're not a slave anymore. Yeah. You don't have to do it. I mean, how many times do we live in a way where it's like, I have to. And Sabbath, this is one of the big, by the way, again, practical things. What is Sabbath? Sabbath is a day where no have-tos, just get-tos. I get to. So that's how that's one of the ways I determine what I'm going to do and not do on a Sabbath. Well, I have to. No, I don't. I'm not a slave anymore. I'm observing the Sabbath today. I'm observing that. So it's okay to take a stroll through a field and grab some grain with some friends because God has freed us to relish in his creation and to enjoy a good snack. It's okay. Jesus is totally in the right there. And even when there's still plenty to do, because after all, there's going to always be plenty to do, right? Yeah. Like, this is one of the critical realities that y'all need to get. So if you've been starting to doze off, don't do that anymore. Okay. You are not going to be rewarded with a Sabbath when you get your to-do list done. That's not how it works. Like, you don't get to go ahead and you go, like, check. And then your eye kind of peels back and you look at the whole list and you just go, all checks. Every box filled in. I did it all. There's nothing else that I had to do that I need to do. I'm done. And so I guess I get a 24-hour period to relish in the goodness of God and his creation and just enjoy him because I've earned it. That's not how it works. Yeah. Like, in fact, that's one of the most disturbing things for us. A lot of us, actually, okay? Here's what happens. Sabbath just comes and then says, okay, stop. But I have, stop. And you're still, like, your to-do list is still sitting there. The dishes are still dirty. The task didn't get complete. The email didn't get sent. But you know what? Okay. You didn't earn Sabbath in the beginning. It's not how it works. You receive it. It's a 24-hour just to enjoy and receive and take, and just in the middle of your work, no apologies needed, no explanations, no reason, except for the fact that God said, I want you to do this, and it's good for you. You can go ahead and do it. Take the day off. And God's like, and you're like, yeah, can I? And God's like, yeah, go ahead and take it. So learning Sabbath, I think, is learning growing to enjoy that. Because some of us, at first, it's not going to feel enjoyable. It's going to be really hard. But that's the external battle, the kind of sense of like all these pressures on me. Are you ready for the last point today? The internal battle is simply this. We are set apart, which is kind of our big thing, as those who know they're image bearers of God, but not God. This is the internal battle of Sabbath. So Exodus, when they go into the first rendition of the Ten Commandments, this is how it's written out in Exodus 20. Remember the Sabbath day. So not observe, it's what? Remember. We're going to get into that in just a second. But to keep it holy, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. Wait, this is a different reason than he gave in Deuteronomy, isn't it? Because in Deuteronomy it was like, hey, you were slaves and now you're not. But in this one, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Made it holy. Remember creation, God says. So these people that just got out of slavery, and he's not going to talk about slavery, which he'll do 40 years later, but this one he just goes, remember how in the very beginning, when God takes a bunch of dirt, and he puts it together, makes it in his image, and then breathes his very life into it. Dust, but bearing the image of the divine. Like God, but totally, absolutely not God. Yeah? Limitations and glory at the same time. Mankind created by God with limitations and yet glory imbued into us. So good for us to remember that he invites us to go ahead and do that. God, remember, he says, that I created you, that you're not the sustainer of the world, like not Sabbathing quietly tries to convince us that we are. Right? Because, I mean, what happens when you stop working? Like when you stop creating, you stop finishing that to-do list. I know how, yeah, exactly. You stop finishing that to-do list, you stop going ahead and getting that last assignment done, or you stop going ahead and making sure that you have all the, what happens when you just stop doing it all? You realize that the world still goes on without you. Because here's the thing, God has given us in some ways no choice on this in the fact that like you can't really not sleep. Like eventually you have to. Yeah. At some point, and the college students, you obviously try to push the barriers on this a lot. We know. Yes, we're proud of you all. Oh, to be young again. But you have to sleep. You have to sleep, right? Let me tell you, you have to sleep, okay? You have to sleep. You have to sleep. And when you sleep, the world keeps on going on. It doesn't come crashing down. In fact, when you get sick, which happens when you don't Sabbath enough, often, by the way. I'm not saying only. I'm just saying if you don't Sabbath, God's like, you're gonna rest either way. Boom, you're kicked down for 2 days. The world still goes. Things still happen. Maybe some of your things don't get done, but like at the end of the day, how many of you have gotten sick? I mean, like 10 years ago, you got sick 10 years ago, and it's forever kept you back. Those 2 days you had the flu, you'll never get back. No. Like the reality is that Sabbath invites us to go ahead and say, hey, what if you consciously, rather than just unconsciously, got to enjoy a day where you realize, I'm not the creator who sustains this world. By the way, I'm hoping, Madeline said it was a little harsh last week, I'm hoping that I'm actually really on the line of being really harsh today, but also really loving. Because this is one of the ones for me that was one of the hardest things, okay? Was this recognition that, like for me, my Sabbath breaking had historically been a God complex. I wouldn't call it that, I didn't want to call it that in the moment, but it absolutely was. Me being reminded that I didn't create anything, that I'm working with what was already created, that God is the one who sustains everything, that he, on a practical note, invites me into going ahead and saying like, hey, why don't you just come in and enjoy this? Remember that our faith story, our faith's creation story reminds us of a couple principles. That's why we're invited to remember creation. Here's what it reminds us, that there is a God, right? Genesis, yeah. There is a God, that we are not him, yeah. That we are his creation. That this means he knows us better than we know ourselves, that he created us in his image, so our identity is found in God, not in what I do. Yeah. That's where my image is found. And not in what I can accomplish or produce or accumulate. That God created a world for us to live in that was good. It's a good world, and there's a lot of good parts to it still. That there's a rhythm that he built into this world that he created. That we don't get invited to stop once we finish all the work, but instead when God just says to stop. And that he loves us enough to say that stopping can be every 7 days. Go ahead, take a day off. I made this for you. We remember that we are not the sum of all of our striving, but more than that. We remember that life is a gift, not a right. That you know what, we're given this gift of life to go ahead and say, I want you to make the most of it. God gives us gifts and talents, and he doesn't go ahead and say, hey, be lazy and just sit on it. But any good thing can also be turning into a bad thing if we misuse it. And your good work, some of you, is unfortunately not carrying the blessing of God because you haven't learned to put it into its right barriers. At the end of the day, it's about recognizing this Sabbath thing is when enough is simply enough. When it's okay to say, like, I could do more. But here it is, Sabbath. So I'm going to go ahead and not do. And again, it's not just, some of y'all, we're going to get into the practical stuff in the next 5 weeks. That's why we have a 7-week series on Sabbath, because there's a lot to dig into. We're going to talk about what it looks like practically. It's not just sitting and staring off at a wall, okay? But are y'all still with me this morning? Yeah. Could you imagine the joy of with the weather the way it is right now, which, by the way, in case you aren't aware, not today. Today's going to be like 91. But like this last week, it was like perfect. Yeah. Could you imagine one of those days where you just didn't? You maybe slept in a little bit, but not like crazy because you want to actually enjoy the day. You get up and you make coffee or tea or, I don't know, water? Yeah. You make water. There's a God complex coming up again. And you just sit out on maybe you go, if you don't have a nice porch or a nice, your own house, maybe you go to the river and you just sit back at the river. No hurry, no rush, no agenda. And you're just spending time with the Lord. And you just kind of get to go God, that's a cool river. Thanks for it. God, I really love this weather. Thanks for days like this that you've given me. And you just spend time talking to him and you can kind of go, God, this was a really hard week for me. I really have struggled with this sense of the things that I'm doing, are they amounting to anything? Or you can, whatever you're dealing with, you can take it to him. Honestly, we're going to get into why I think Sundays are a good day for most of us to go ahead and do it, why worship gets to be a part of it. But at the end of the day, this is just about us realizing that the Sabbath, Jesus himself says, was made for you. Yeah. He said, hey, I made this for you. And unfortunately, the Pharisees were all about the legalism of okay, well then we have to follow these rules. And for many of us, we've simply forgotten that this is something that God designed for us to have and to function with. And because we haven't maybe been honoring the Sabbath, we haven't been observing the Sabbath, our lives are functioning really messy and a lot like everyone else in this world. And I'm hoping that today, for some of us, it's all of a sudden it's oh, maybe that's the big difference. I mean, maybe it's not just that, but maybe one of the biggest things can be that simply honoring the Sabbath could absolutely transform over the course of, because here's the thing, I'll end by this. There we go. I'll end by this. If you choose to Sabbath this next week, for the first time in months, you're probably not going to feel immediately a sense of oh, well, that was a relief and what a joy and God really met me in that and wow, what a work God is doing in my life. It probably will feel difficult and annoying and a lot of other things that are just that was not what Jonathan promised. His advertising was totally off, But here's what I will say. Sabbathing or not Sabbathing have cumulative effects. So if you Sabbath and you just choose to do it and you honor it and you honor it and you honor it, you become a more restful person. Less and less restless, more and more restful. And if you choose to not do it, you're not going to feel the effects probably on week one. But you'll gain a lot of unnecessary heaviness by not doing it. So I want to invite you via the one who invites us to rest. Can I pray for you? God, we thank you that there is a rest that Jesus invites us to. And that as Jesus called himself the Lord of the Sabbath, would you help us to understand what it means for the Sabbath to be made by you for me, for each and every one of us, to enjoy and to experience your goodness, that we'd recognize, okay, what is this thing that God made for me? How does it work? And then God, would you help us to be set apart as holy by keeping the Sabbath day holy? Help us to learn. Each of us is going to look different in our own lives of what it looks like to go ahead and say, this is this day that's going to be different. It's going to be set apart. I'm not going to do like I do every other day. God, I'm just begging you to do a work in our hearts, Holy Spirit, that challenges us to not just hear these words, but to live different lives because of it. May we recognize that we are not slaves, like the rest of the world might feel like they are. And God, would you help us to recognize that we are made in the image of God, but we are not God. We're free from that responsibility. Jesus, you are the one we trust. It's in your name we pray. Amen.